Welcome, I'm Steve Winnick. I'm a folklife specialist at the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress. And I'm here with a musician who's going to be performing tonight at the Library of Congress. His name is Jake Blount. He plays banjo, guitar, and fiddle. He sings, and he adapts material from our archive here at the American Folklife Center. We're very happy to have him as part of our African American History Month programming here at the Library of Congress. So welcome, Jake Blount. We are so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, and thank you for being here. So we're going to ask you a few questions about your career and how you got into this music. And we'll just start. We know that you're a native of Washington, D.C., and here we are in your native city. So tell us about growing up in D.C. a little bit.
It was a different city in a lot of ways when I was growing up, some good, some bad. But you know, I was born in '95. I lived my whole life in Northwest DC, went to school here and everything. And it's a strange city, and I think I'm only discovering all the ways in which it's strange now that I've moved away and I'm living somewhere normal. And then I do something like drive in over the bridge and there's like attack helicopters swooping over my head, and I'm going, oh, that's not normal. But it was a vibrant place, and you know, there was go-go music always at the Chinatown Metro stop and all of that. A lot of hardcore music, a lot of really good rap and hip hop happening. There's a lot around, and even though I haven't necessarily fallen into those musical niches, I definitely credit the creative atmosphere of the city with getting me involved in this stuff to begin with.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting question, though, as to how one would go from an environment where you're surrounded by more modern forms of music to get into old-time music as much as you have. So how did that happen?
So I started out playing electric guitar in rock bands when I was like 12, and I kind of got worn out of it. I wasn't really finding musical fulfillment there and was really enjoying listening to more things. And through a series of bizarre coincidences that are too twisty to recite here, I wound up running into this band playing at a now defunct Americana festival called like Sweet Tea Pumpkin Pie Fest or something. It was the 2010s. That was what they were doing back then. And it was in an Ethiopian restaurant on U Street, and they were getting paid in tacos by the Ethiopian place. It was very confusing. But they got up on stage, and it was this woman singing and playing the washboard and this guy playing the banjo. And they're called Meg and Jean in the KFB. They're still dear friends and mentors of mine. And the guy, Byrne, played banjo in a way that I hadn't seen before. And I went up to him after the show and was like, hey, what was that? You know, I've seen people do the bluegrass finger picking thing, but you were playing this in a way I've never seen anyone play any instrument before. And he said, oh, this is called clawhammer. And it was passed down alongside, you know, the African American tradition of the banjo, and told me that enslaved African Americans invented the instrument. I had no idea. So he told me all of that, and when I started to get more interested in my musical heritage because of different activist things that were happening, like the Black Lives Matter movement, that really inspired me to see how my ancestors thought about life and their circumstances and their struggles, I decided I would look into the banjo and the fiddle stuff as well. And once I learned more about it, started messing around with it, got a few lessons, I found this really wonderful community attached to it and just got drawn into traveling around and seeing my friends and playing tunes together. And I didn't expect it to become a job. I thought I was going to graduate from college, take a year to like pick apples in my friend's orchard, and then go to grad school. But I wound up with too many gigs to hold down a job in between the gigs, and it just snowballed, and here we are.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you know, banjo and fiddle, and these are instruments that are sort of really an important part of African American history, but a lot of people don't know that, right? Yes. They associate them more with white musicians, essentially. How have you negotiated that or found that to affect your career?
I think in some ways, I'm not having to lead the charge on that because I'm coming on the heels of a generation of players who are, you know, 15, 20 years older than me. Like the Carolina Chocolate Drops, for example, Rhiannon Giddens, Dom Flemons, Justin Robinson, that whole crew. they started that conversation and brought it to enough places and enough people that I don't feel I'm often in the position of having to convince people. And I'm very grateful for that because it's exhausting when I have to do it. But I think that music communities sometimes can struggle to understand the ways that our past behaviors and ideas might affect the way that we behave now. I think in the industry that often takes the form of, say, you know, country industry folks talking about how the country music industry wrote black folks out of this tradition at the beginning, and that's part of the problem, right? They don't talk about how the exact same type of logic is what's causing labels and radio stations and publicists and whoever in the country and Americana sphere to not work with people of color in the same way they do white people today. Similarly, traditional musicians, people who are playing old-time music, don't often really think about the fact that the sound they can oftentimes be really zealous about protecting is a sound that was born of a conscious effort to segregate the music, right? The idea of the sound that we've been handed down was that black people have been erased from it. We were not supposed to be included. And I think my position, now that people know we were there, is to answer people's questions about why are you not here anymore, which are multifaceted. It's a complicated question, but when people talk about how do we get black people back into this, I think that's the question I get more than anything. I say you have to have an open mind about the music as well as the people. You can't expect black people to walk in and play the way that you play and make the same sounds that you want to hear and have the same ideas about the music and the tradition that you do, because we have a different perspective. And that doesn't mean that yours is wrong, but yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense. So what reaction have you gotten to that generally?
I think it depends. I think when I'm able to interact face-to-face with people and put it that way, it's common sense, right? Like, why would you expect someone from a different cultural background to come in and play music the exact same way that you do?
Right.
I think that where people wind up in trouble, particularly folks of older generations than me, is that they have these very worshipful relationships with a lot of people that they knew who were elders when they were first starting to play. And I get that, because I have my own elders who I'm very protective of, and who I would be really upset if people started trashing them after they were gone. And I'm sure I'm going to have to deal with that. And I hope that I come back and watch this when I have to deal with it and remember that the shoe was once on the other foot. But I don't think people are often ready to acknowledge what it means to a black person that the whole scene is worshiping Tommy Jarrell when he was like recorded saying the N-word. And the black people that I know who went to visit him had not a great experience of that. Their bandmates have told me about the vibe that was there, and it wasn't great. And that's not a shock, and it's not an indictment of Tommy as a person. He was a white man from North Carolina in the time that he lived. Like, it was going to be what it was. But I think we have to get to a place of acknowledging the major contributions people have made throughout folk music of all different colors, without needing to believe that they were the best people. And I think I run into that in my tradition as well, right? There's bluesmen whose music I play who were, you know, killers, domestic abusers, right? Like a lot of people who I love the music and I'm so grateful that they passed it down. But, like, I can't defend that guy as a person, and I think that's a hard line for everybody.
Yeah, it is. It's a hard line with a lot of our collections, as you know. There people could, you know, we don't even know that much about some of them, but some of them have the kind of issues that you've discussed. So another interesting thing about your music lately is you've been getting into indigenous fiddle traditions as well. So tell us about how that interest started, if you would.
Yeah, I think when I first started making records, the goal was kind of, I'm exploring my own heritage through the craft. And my family is mixed in that way. It's complicated, as many Black Indian families are, in terms of enrollment and things like that, but we have documented ancestorship, and many of my cousins are enrolled members of the Chickahominy Nation, Chickahominy tribe. So they're part of that. They have a thing going on, and for family reasons, I haven't always been connected. But when I took on the task of trying to represent my history, I wound up feeling pretty conflicted about it, because on one hand, I don't want to walk out as the representative for somebody else's traditions, but on the other hand, I don't want to write my family out of the story that I'm telling, right? Not only do I have ancestors, I have cousins who are alive that I have relationships with, and I don't want to tell a version of the story that doesn't include them. So I made the choice to present these things alongside one another, and I wound up finding other places that they overlapped, right? Like Leadbelly, Charlie Patton, Dink Roberts, these people who were both Black and Indigenous, and then wound up developing a relationship with some members of the Sneed family, descendants of Manco Sneed and his siblings, Osco, Pico, Campbell, Rose, I guess descendants of John Sneed, the father, writ large, in Cherokee, North Carolina. I went there to play some of his music at the Museum of the Cherokee Indian, and met some of his family members who were really touched by us performing that, and shared some recordings that they had that we didn't have, and invited us to play at their family reunion, actually. And it's funny, one of them lives here in DC and shows up to my shows here sometimes, so I wonder if he'll be here tonight. It's a thing I have a very self-conscious relationship with, because I know first-person experience-wise what it is to have somebody misrepresent my people on a public stage. And I try to really maintain contact with Indigenous folks that I know will hold me accountable if I mess up, and they have been, you know. It's been interesting to hear what they want to hear me do when I present that material. I think I feel very comfortable in the way I present Black traditions and the issues that I tie in when I'm presenting that music, the historical narratives that I embrace and that I interrogate. I think I don't know how to do that sometimes with Indigenous fiddle repertoire, and I was touring with a good Indigenous bandmate of mine, Molly Abamsawin, and she had some friends come to the show, and after the show, they were all like, "You don't talk about it enough."
Oh, interesting.
They were like, "You're Indigenous, and you're on the stage and you're playing this stuff, and it's amazing that you're doing that, but how, like, tie in the issues, talk more about us." And I have felt unqualified to do it. So this was one of those things where I don't think of myself as being involved enough in the community to claim that, but they claimed me in that moment and kind of called me in about it, and I'm thinking about it really hard. I've kind of cooled off on presenting that until I figure out the right way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, in general, negotiating the context of the music that you perform has got to be a tricky task for you sometimes.
Absolutely. And it's important to me, especially where the Indigenous repertoire is concerned, that it's coming from a place of solidarity and mutual respect. And I think that it's been received that way. But I think a lot about that.
Yeah, well, it's good that you do, and I've seen some of your performances before, and it's wonderful to have that context given to you as an audience member along with the music, so that you have a sense of where some of this came from. I think that's really important. So thank you for doing that work. Now, you mentioned that you have a lot of mentors, and I wonder if there's any you'd like to mention in this context.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Kathy Fink is going to be here tonight, who is like basically my shadow manager. Anytime something weird happens, I call Kathy and I'm like, "What's going on?" She's the best. Jeff Klaus and Judy Hyman, who are members of a band called the Horseflies, part of this Ithaca old-time regional thing up in upstate New York that I did my undergraduate thesis on, and they've become really good friends. I'd spend years following Judy around trying to fiddle exactly like her, and kind of succeeded, and then immediately departed to do my own thing. But they've been really supportive. Jeff just wrote my rec letter to help me get into grad school, and Judy and he produced my first record, Spider Tales. So,
excellent.
Yeah,
cool. So, in your work as a musician, how do you actually select the items that you're going to perform? I mean, the traditions that you're listening to are vast, and I know you've done a lot of research. And what is it about a piece you think that speaks to you?
The first qualifier for me is always what feels honest. There are a lot of songs that I listen to, and I might like the song, but it doesn't sound like a song that I would sing. And I'm really appreciative of our archival resources, of all of the information that we now have access to. I'm also conscious of the fact that in some ways that changes how the tradition operates, and that people are now able to just kind of have a grab bag of things that they wouldn't have had the luxury of accessing before, myself included. I do think about that, but I listen to a lot of stuff, and there is a very small proportion of that at any given time that I feel moved to perform myself. And I'm glad there are other people to do the rest.
That makes sense, yeah. So one of the things that you've been involved in the music performing community is the idea of diversity and equity and inclusion. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that's affecting the roots music community?
Yeah, I think there's so many angles to that question that it's hard to come up with a catch-all answer, because I think there are a lot of different things we've been having to deal with, and that's part of why it's been such an active discussion in the past few years. I mean, you have the Me Too movement and that dialogue being had in the old-time community. You have Black Lives Matter and that dialogue being had in the old-time community. Increasingly and gratifyingly, we're having conversations about class in the old-time community and about rurality in the old-time community, and the ways in which even when we're playing Appalachian music, people from urban northern settings and privileged financial backgrounds, myself included, this is an indictment of me, tend to take up a lot of the spotlight. And I think for professional musicians like myself, it's a clearer set of questions as far as like, I'm pretty conscientious about who I hire, so I know I'm not perpetuating that, right? It'd be really easy for me living in Providence to just like hire a bunch of Berkeley students and go on the road, and I won't do it. So there are action steps for us to take, the ways we use our platform to speak and the people we choose to divide our very small amount of money with. But I think for a community, it's a harder question because there's not an economic thing to analyze, at least in the same way. So a lot of people, I think, are left asking, what can I do? And it's a hard question because I can't tell you, you need to hire this person if you're not hiring anybody, or you need to make sure you tour to these places if you're not touring. What I can tell people is this community is built on individual interactions that we have with each other, right? When I'm at Clifftop or Mount Airy or any other big old time festival and there's other Black people there, we don't talk about it in a structural way. We talk about the interactions we've had with individual people, because there isn't as much of a structure at those things. There isn't as much of a hierarchy. There is one, but not as much. And that's a good thing, but it means that there's more of an onus on all of us to take responsibility for creating the environment we want to see.
And you've also been open about discussing being part of the LGBTQ community within the folk music environment. Talk a little about that, because it's a less visible community in certain ways than being, you know, African American or white, for example. So how does that discussion happen these days?
I think we're in a very good spot with that, actually. I think the question at this point is how to make queerness visible in the tradition and not if. And that's really nice. I know I had a conversation with Kathy and Marcy Marks, or her partner, and a bunch of queer folk musicians of my generation just a couple months ago. That was really interesting to me. And Kathy and Marcy kind of expressed some confusion over like the way we talk about it, and like, why are you like branding yourself this way? Because they had to fight really hard to not be boxed into that and constrained by it. And it wasn't coming from a place of criticism. They understand there's a reason why we're doing it. But what I said, and what my good friend Justin Hiltner echoed, because he's kind of writing the folk songs for us in this moment, we don't have an oral tradition in history that is preserved, at least going back in the way that we do these other identities, right? I can come here to the Library of Congress and say, I want to find Black fiddle tunes, and you have all of them. And if I was to come here and say, I want queer fiddle tunes, everyone would be like, I don't know. And like statistically, they were there. We know they were there,
right.
But they couldn't be open about it. And what I see as my task and the task of my generation as the first generation of people who've been in this community and been able to be open the whole time, as opposed to being Kathy and Marcy and having to be really careful about how they handled it because people were crazy and violent and scary with them. I am now in the position of building the oral tradition along with the other members of my generation, right? We are creating the foundational texts. My friend Justin is writing the songs, right? Tatiana Hargraves is playing the fiddle tunes. Ngozi Fields is playing the fiddle tunes. It's happening now. And that's really exciting. But what I said to Kathy when she was wondering why we go out of our way sometimes to make it clear who we are is, for one thing, I one time had a student in one of my classes come up to me and say, I wasn't sure, and now we've talked about it, so now I'm sure, but it would have meant a lot to me to know before I had met you. And I took that to heart, and over the pandemic, kind of brought it into focus. I'm here, I'm doing things like this. I'm thinking about the queer black kid 100 years from now who's going to come here looking for the exact same thing that I've been looking for and find me. And what I want to be very careful about is that I'm not creating a situation where historians motivated by a specific political or religious lens can erase that part of me, because that happens so often. You know, you go back in history, you find all these examples of people who were quite obviously part of the LGBT community as we define it today, but it gets hidden under euphemisms or tucked away. I don't want people to be able to do that with me.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's another important, thing to do. And as you say, to respond to your students who might say, I want to know this about you, about the people that I admire. I think it's great to be open about that. So thank you. So let's talk a little about your musical projects, and we can start with Spider Tales, your previous album. So tell us how you came up with that concept and the material that you picked for that.
So I started with this EP called Reparations, which was just a very simple duo EP I recorded with Tatiana Hargraves in the studio in my college arts center. It doesn't sound great from that angle, but the music is good, I think. I stand by it. And when we started playing shows together, we had to learn a bunch of more stuff because it's just not long enough to fill a whole set with material from that release. So we added a lot of things, and eventually I started to get more in touch with the themes I was interested in exploring. I wasn't just saying, I'm going to learn every black fiddle tune, because that's hard, but saying, I like these ones, or looking at the songs and going, I like ones that are exploring this material, that kind of thing. And it started to shape itself into a pretty cohesive body of work that questioned a lot of the assumptions I felt people were making about what I was doing. My very first show after Reparations came out, my first show as a professional musician, first time I signed a contract, was down in North Carolina at this furniture maker's workshop, and Cecilia Conway had put it together. And it was a wild ride, as her events always are. And at the end of it, this woman came up to me, and I just, played John Henry and talked about the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. And she said, it is so good to see a young black person learning from the older generations, because today's black people are just too angry. And I was like, you came here so deeply expecting me to shuck and jive and make everybody comfortable that you ignored everything I said.
Yeah.
And it made me that much more determined to find a darker strain in the music so that people couldn't co-opt me in that way. And I went back to Tatiana's house that night and learned The Angels Done Bowed Down, which is this old spiritual that appears on Spider Tales. And that kind of planted the seed. So we wound up working out a bunch of songs that fell in line with that, exploring these narratives of anger and resentment that have existed in the music the whole time. And teasing those out, making them more open and obvious through modern arrangement. And I think that it worked. One of the things that was really surprising about that, I thought I was just putting out an old time record and the same 500 people that hear every other old time record would hear it, and it would never go further than that. And it got a ton of coverage because that album came out as the Minneapolis police precinct was burning. I mean, it dropped the same night, and the whole music industry was going, what are we going to say about it? And I dropped it right in their lap. So they took it and ran with it. It was really nice. But weird to know that you have made your career on the back of something like that.
Yeah.
And I think about it a lot. I am really proud of the record, though, and really enthusiastic about the ensemble because other than cameos made by Jeff and Judy, who were producing it, it's an all-queer band. It had 5 people and was still completely gender balanced. And I didn't do that on purpose. I literally just was like, I'm going to make an old-time record. Who's my dream team for an old-time record? So I called Rachel Eddy and Nick Garris and Hazy Siako and Tatiana Hargraves, and we went from there.
All right.
And I love that that's present. I love that I could do that, and I hope to do it again.
All right. Yeah, it's great, and it references really old traditions and, of course, brings them to light in a new way, which is something we love here at the Library of Congress. And your next recording, the one that's the most current, is, of course, The New Faith.
Yes.
And it's really interesting in that it takes an Afrofuturist perspective, sort of inspired by literary works as well as by traditional music. So talk a little about that, if you would, about the Afrofuturist strain.
Yeah. One of the things that I started to do on Spider Tales that was really exciting to me was questioning boundaries of genre. And I think that is part of the queer project of traditional music, is questioning these pre-designed categories. I also think that someone coming at the music from an anti-racist perspective, knowing the history of how those genres were constructed, understands, oh yeah, back in the day, like country musicians and blues musicians and jug bands and string bands, it was the same people flowing back and forth to different things over time. And I love that. I love the variety that produced. I loved how those genres used to flow into one another and quite audibly inform one another. And I miss that. So we decided that we were going to do that on Spider Tales, and I think it worked. And what I then felt was lacking, because every time I do something, I hear that lady from the show in North Carolina in my head co-opting me for something I don't believe in. I was like, okay, how do I push it further? And the way that felt honest to do that was to change up the context. And I've always been really interested in working with spirituals. I love those songs. I love the energy of those recordings. I love the energy of the room when they're being sung in church. But as a queer person, I've often felt completely unwelcome in those church spaces, right? Like when I went to my grandmother's funeral last summer, the pastor would not shake my hand while I was walking out behind her coffin. Like, I'm not wanted, and I know that. But throwing those traditions into the future lets me imagine a context for them in which I am, and nobody can take that away from me. And one of the wonderful things about folk music is because it's passed through so many hands. Nobody owns it. Nobody can keep me out. And putting it into the future, inventing a new context for it that still felt really loyal to the tenets of the faith in the original recordings, but made room for me, it was the connection with those songs I've been wanting to have. And it also let me continue that like genre queer boundary busting thing of like, I'm going to invite a rapper to be on this. We're going to have percussion, because if drums hadn't been illegal for black people to own in this country, old time music would still have percussion, right? There's like all this stuff that we just don't think about. And I think even as I do view it as part of my role to be an ambassador for the traditions, I also think part of the work of black people of this generation, with our unprecedented, though still flawed, level of freedom that we have, is to be restorative and not just replicate the damage that was done to our traditions, but say, what should it have been? Justice does not look like acknowledging the damage that was done. It looks like trying to fix it.
Right.
Or imagine what it would have been if it had never been done.
Yeah.
And I think the new faith is my first step into that. It feels like the first time I've really uncovered what I'm supposed to do as an artist. You know, I love Spider Tales. I know a lot of musicians who could have made that. I don't know anybody else who could have made the new faith in the way that I did, and I'm really proud of that.
And a big part of the new faith, and we think it's great as well, and we'll talk more about individual songs from it in a minute, but one of the things that's really interesting about it is you talk about the damage that's been done to traditions and trying to restore that, but of course the album also has a lot to do with damage that's been done to the earth.
Yes.
So climate change is a big part of the project. So explain the new context that you invented for the music for that album.
So I envisioned a future a couple 100 years, 100 years. I didn't get specific about it on purpose, because who knows? It could be 20 years, the way things are going, in which the climate has gotten bad enough that there have been mass migrations due to resource scarcity and inclement weather. People have moved within the United States. The food shortages and land shortages and refugee crises have precipitated some kind of nuclear conflict. There's no great detail given about how everything collapsed, but it's post-collapse. And I never call it post-apocalyptic. People love to say that, but I do not. I think there's a whole thing that I could write or say about how people synonymize a pause in the expansion of capitalist empire with the end of the world. I don't believe that. So it's a different future, and not an entirely happy one. The premise is, what happens if nothing changes in the way we're approaching these issues? So far from the apocalypse, there's been no doomsday event. We've continued with business as usual, and it's come back to bite us. So these are the descendants of black refugees who've come up from the South and been kind of corralled in a refugee camp on an island off the coast of New England. And the songs have taken on new significance due to what they've been through.
So in addition to Afrofuturist writers, another group of people that you thank on that album is the Gullah Geechee community.
Yes.
So explain your connection to that community and those songs.
So I have less of a connection than I would want, and that's largely because I discovered how much I love their music in the middle of the pandemic. And I was like emailing with people, and we were like typing messages. You know, there was stuff that happened, and I still haven't made it down. So that's like definitely on my list. But what draws me to the music, apart from just the wonderful style that they have, is going back through the songs that were collected in the region that my family is from. There's a lot of overlap. And I was asking people, I just like went to Twitter the other day and was like, does anybody know if there was like some mass migration like to or from, like between Tidewater, Virginia and the Sea Islands? Because these are songs I haven't heard in other places, and they overlap a lot. So I feel shared heritage in a lot of those songs, and there are recordings of them in a way that there aren't really recordings of stuff from where my family's from, around Smithfield, Virginia. There are some, but few, and not that. So I have loved their recordings. I have learned so much from the way that they present those songs, in the spirit of the performance, in the way that they deal with the percussion. That's been a huge factor in the way that I've built out my percussion tracks. The songs themselves, I just, like, I can't imagine the loss it would be to the historical record if we did not have that. Just incredible artistry. Yeah.
And we're happy that we're able to help preserve those recordings here at the Library of Congress, because we have a lot of collections going back to the 1920s, but the ones that you listen to, I guess, primarily from the 1950s and 60s.
Yes.
But wonderful materials. So let's talk a little bit about how you discovered the Library of Congress collections that you've mined for this album.
Man, it's really funny. So the first time I started really digging into old source recordings, I mean, of course you have like, you know, online resources like Slippery Hill for fiddle tunes and stuff that kind of just give you a lot of files. But I went to my college music library, and they had a ton of compilation CDs. And I started learning things off the compilation CDs, and then I would go look them up and discover they were from the Library of Congress. One after the other, I was like, everything that I like is in the Library of Congress. So at one point, my friend Riley Calcagno was interning here, and I came and visited and listened to the Gribble, Lusk, and York recordings, and it was great. I love that stuff. And even now, you know, I have kind of a big stable of recordings on my computer, and I go there first, and a lot of it comes from here.
Yeah, your album references Vera Hall and Bessie Jones and Tangalai and a bunch of other, Blind Willie McTell, a bunch of recordings from our archive, and we really appreciate when people do that. We love people to be inspired by our recordings and to use them in a new way, and I think the New Faith does a great job of doing that.
Well, thank you.
We are really looking forward to your concert tonight in the 2023 Homegrown Concert Series here at the Library of Congress. Jake Blount, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you.